The skies over Europe were never quiet in 1943. They creaked, clanked, and blazed. High above the European mainland, aluminum silhouettes moved across the faint blue rim of the stratosphere, forming white scars in the fabric of the sky. That was contrails, not just direction, but destination as well. Among these silhouettes was an aircraft that, by the laws of aerodynamics and the probabilities, should not have been flying. And yet it flew. And this is the story of how a B-17 Flying Fortress, damaged and broken, with two engines missing, stayed aloft, and what it would reveal about the aircraft, the men, and the math involved in air warfare. By the middle of World War I, the war over Europe had become a grinding contest of endurance. On the ground, armies moved by miles and months. In the air, battles unfolded in seconds. The United States Army Air Forces believed that daylight precision bombing, flying straight and level into enemy territory, could break Germany's industrial backbone. It was a bold idea, some would say reckless. The aircraft chosen to carry that burden was the B-17 Flying Fortress. 4 engines, a wingspan wider than a tennis court, bristling with machine guns designed to fly higher and farther than most fighters could reach. The B-17 was meant to absorb punishment and keep going. Boeing engineers didn't call it a fortress lightly, but even fortresses can fall. German defenses were ruthless. Flak bursts tore the sky apart with black blossoms of steel. Fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke Wolf 190s, slashed through bomber formations like sharks through a school of fish. Losses were staggering. Entire crews vanished in minutes. And yet over and over again, B-17s came back riddled with holes, trailing smoke, missing pieces, and sometimes missing engines. To understand why a B-17 flying with 2 engines gone mattered so much, you have to understand what should have happened. The B-17 was powered by 4 Wright R 1,820 Cyclone radial engines, each producing roughly 1,200 horsepower. Lose 1 engine, and the aircraft could usually limp along, especially at altitude. Lose 2, and things became far more complicated. If the engines were on the same wing, the aircraft would experience massive asymmetric thrust, pulling it violently to one side. How pilots would have to fight the controls constantly, using rudder trim and aileron just to stay level. Drag from windmilling propellers could become catastrophic unless the crew managed to feather the blades, turning them edge onto the airflow. If the engines were on opposite wings, thrust would be balanced, but power would be severely reduced. The aircraft might not be able to maintain altitude, especially with battle damage, wounded crew, and a full bomb load. According to performance manuals and post-war analysis, a fully loaded B-17 at combat weight was not expected to sustain level flight at high altitude on 2 engines. And yet, according to mission reports and combat photography, many did. That contradiction between theory and reality is where this story begins. The day typically began before dawn. Crews assembled in drafty briefing rooms on English airfields, Basing Bourne, Thorpe Abbotts, Polbrook. The smell of coffee mixed with damp wool and cigarette smoke. Maps were pulled back. Red yarn traced routes deep into enemy territory. Targets were revealed. Ball, bearing factories, aircraft plants, rail yards. Some crews stared silently. Others cursed. Everyone understood the odds. A typical B. 17 crew numbered 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, top turret gunner, radio operator, ball turret gunner, and 2 waist gunners, plus the tail gunner. Most were barely in their 20s. Many had never flown before joining the Army Air Forces. They trusted the aircraft. They had to. By mid-morning, engines roared to life. One by one, the fortresses lumbered down grass runways, barely clearing hedgerows as they clawed into the sky. They formed up over the English countryside, circling until hundreds of bombers merged into massive combat boxes. Then they turned east. Crossing the North Sea was often the calmest part of the mission. Crews checked oxygen systems, tested guns, reviewed emergency procedures. Nervous jokes crackled over intercoms. Then the European coastline appeared. Almost immediately, black flak bursts began to pepper the sky. German anti-aircraft gunners had honed their craft to deadly precision. Shells were fused to explode at bomber altitude, filling the air with jagged steel fragments. A flak hit didn't need to strike directly. Near misses could shred control cables, puncture fuel tanks, or tear chunks out of wings. Engines were particularly vulnerable. Radial engines, exposed and unarmored, could be knocked out by a single fragment. Oil lines severed. Cylinders shattered. Fires erupted. When an engine failed, the cockpit filled with alarms and vibration. The aircraft yawed violently. Pilots reacted instantly, throttling back, trimming, calling out procedures. The flight engineer rushed to shut off fuel and feather the propeller if possible. One engine out was survivable. Two, that was where survival became uncertain. Combat reports describe moments that unfolded in seconds, but felt like hours. A fortress takes a direct flak hit in the right wing. Engine number 3 coughs, belches smoke, then goes silent. The aircraft lurches. The pilot wrestles the yoke. The engineer feathers the prop. Before the crew can stabilize, a fighter attack rakes the left wing. Engine number 1 bursts into flame. Fuel pours out in a shimmering mist. Fire warning lights scream. Now the bomber is flying on 2 engines, one on each wing. Altitude begins to bleed away. The formation keeps going. Bombers cannot slow down or maneuver easily without endangering others. Stragglers become targets. The damaged B-17 falls behind. Inside, the crew faces impossible choices. Do they drop bombs early to lighten the load? That might help them stay aloft but violates mission orders. Do they turn back alone, exposed to fighters, or do they press on, hoping the aircraft holds together long enough to reach friendly skies? According to mission debriefs, many crews did exactly that. They stayed with the formation as long as they could, then turned for home when it became clear they could not continue. That turn was often the most dangerous moment of all. Once separated from the protective guns of the bomber stream, crippled B-17s became magnets for German fighters. Pilots reported attacks from every direction: head, on passes, stern chases, belly shots aimed at the vulnerable ball turret. With only 2 engines producing power, the aircraft struggled to maintain even modest airspeed. Control surfaces felt heavy, every correction cost altitude, and yet, again and again, crews reported something remarkable. The aircraft did not immediately fall. The B-17's massive wing area provided generous lift at lower speeds. Its rugged construction, multiple spars, redundant control systems, meant that damage which would doom lighter aircraft could sometimes be absorbed. Even fuel tanks, though vulnerable, were often self-sealing. The airplane was not graceful. It wallowed, it shuddered, it leaked, but it flew. One pilot later recalled, according to post-war interviews, that the aircraft felt like a wounded animal that refused to lie down. Over the years, stories grew around these survivals. Some claimed that bomber formations created a kind of air cushion that kept damaged aircraft aloft. Others suggested that sheer luck or divine intervention played a role. Modern aerodynamic analysis has debunked the formation lift myth. There is no significant upwash strong enough to keep a multi-ton bomber airborne. What actually kept those aircraft flying was a combination of engineering margins, pilot skill, and sheer stubbornness. The B-17 was designed conservatively. Its wings could generate lift even when riddled with holes. Its engines, when feathered correctly, minimized drag. Pilots learned to fly at the edge of stall, balancing power, angle of attack, and trim with exquisite care. Every pound mattered. Crews threw out ammunition, equipment, even personal gear to stay airborne. Some jettisoned guns. Others cut loose damaged turrets. Survival was not elegant. It was desperate. It is easy to talk about aircraft as machines, but inside every B-17 was a collection of human beings, each reacting differently to crisis. The pilot focused on keeping the wings level. The co-pilot scanned instruments, calling out airspeed and altitude. The navigator recalculated courses as landmarks slipped by beneath cloud cover. Gunners watched helplessly as fighters circled, unable to bring all guns to bear. The ball turret gunner, trapped in a plexiglass sphere beneath the fuselage, felt every vibration, every drop in altitude, acutely aware that landing gear failure could mean being unable to exit the turret before landing. Fear was constant, but so was discipline. Training emphasized crew coordination, repetition, procedure. In emergencies, muscle memory took over. According to historical records, many crews later reported feeling strangely calm during the worst moments, too busy to panic. By the time damaged B-17s limped back toward the English coast, they were often barely recognizable, wings shredded, tail sections half gone, engines dead or over. Ground crews would stare in disbelief as aircraft staggered in and touched down, sometimes collapsing on landing, sometimes rolling to a stop as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Photographs taken after missions show fortresses with entire engine nacelles missing, control surfaces torn away, holes large enough to crawl through. These images circulated widely. They became propaganda, proof that American bombers could take punishment and keep coming. But behind every photograph was a quieter truth. For every B-17 that made it home with 2 engines gone, many others did not. Survivorship bias colored memory. The ones that returned became legends. The ones that vanished left no photographs. So how did a B-17 stay in the air with two engines gone? The answer is not a single miracle. It is a convergence of over-engineering, aerodynamics pushed to their limit, crews trained to react under fire, and moments where physics allowed just enough margin. In the next part of this documentary, we will follow one such aircraft from the moment of impact to the edge of controlled flight and examine, minute by minute, how survival unfolded in the thin air over enemy territory. Because what happened next shocked not only the men inside the aircraft, but even the enemy who tried to bring it down. But when the flak caught up with them, the B-17 had been flying for hours. At 24,000 feet, the cold was absolute, below minus 40 degrees Celsius. The cold seeped through every seam in the airplane. Frost etched the glass of the instruments. The oxygen masks fogged with each breath. The engines hummed in a smooth, rhythmic beat that had become almost mesmerizing. 4 radial engines in harmony, their rhythmic beat pushing the bombers deep into Europe. Beneath them, the continent rolled by in a tapestry of farmland, rivers, and tracks. Somewhere below was where the factories churned out munitions, ball bearings, aircraft parts. This was the reasoning behind daylight bombing. Dismantle the engine and the war would stall, but logic did not stop shells. The first burst appeared off the left wing, black puffs that expanded and vanished almost instantly. German flak gunners were walking their fire upward, adjusting by sight, by timing, by experience. Each burst was a calculation. Then one of those calculations was correct. There is no gentle way to describe flak. It does not announce itself with a clean explosion. It rips. Steel fragments, irregular and jagged, tear outward in every direction. When they strike aluminum skin, the sound is not a bang, but a brutal tearing noise like metal being peeled apart. The B-17 shuddered. In the cockpit, warning lights flickered. The aircraft yawed to the right. The pilot instinctively pushed against the controls. Boots braced against the rudder pedals. Number 3's hit, the flight engineer shouted. Engine 3! The inboard engine on the right wing was coughing oil and smoke. RPMs dropped. The steady hum collapsed into a grinding, uneven roar. The procedures were drilled into them. Throttle back. Mixture idle cut off. Feather the propeller before it windmilled itself into a drag, producing disc. The engineer reached for the controls. Too late. The engine seized with a violent jolt, the propellers shuddering before locking at an awkward angle. Drag surged. The aircraft lurched again, losing airspeed, slipping sideways in the formation. The pilot fought it back into line, sweat forming under layers of fleece and leather despite the cold. One engine gone, they could still fly. Bomber formations were rigid for a reason. Mutual defense depended on interlocking fields of fire. Leave your position, and you expose not just yourself, but the aircraft around you. So the pilot held station. The B-17 flew heavier on one side now. Trim tabs were adjusted. Rudder pressure increased. Every correction demanded strength. These aircraft were not fly-by-wire. They were muscle and cable and steel. The bombardier called out the target ahead. Minutes remained. That was when the fighters came. German fighters rarely attacked randomly. They waited for weakness. The damaged fortress, struggling slightly, lagging by a few hundred feet, was suddenly isolated. A Focke-Wulf 190 came in from below and behind, its nose-mounted cannons flashing briefly in the sunlight. The sound inside the bomber was deafening. Rounds tore through the left wing. Fuel sprayed, atomized into a mist that ignited almost instantly. "Fire on one!" someone yelled. Engine number 1, the outboard engine on the left wing, was engulfed. Now the aircraft was no longer just damaged, it was crippled. This was the moment pilots feared most. That 2 engines out meant reduced power, increased drag, and the ever-present risk of uncontrollable yaw. The aircraft began to lose altitude almost immediately, sinking despite full power on the remaining engines. The pilot pushed the throttles forward. The surviving engines, numbers 2 and 4, howled in protest. Airspeed hovered just above stall. The engineer fought the fire, pulling fuel cutoffs, activating extinguishers. Flames guttered, then died, leaving the engine a blackened, twisted mass. The propeller was feathered just in time. Silence replaced the roar on the left side. Now the B-17 was flying on 2 engines, one on each wing. Balanced thrust, yes, but barely enough lift, and they were still over enemy territory. Protocol said one thing, survival suggested another. They could turn back now, jettison their bombs, lighten the load, and attempt a long, dangerous flight home, but they were already minutes from the target. The bombardier looked up from his Norden bomb sight. He knew what that decision meant. Dropping bombs early reduced accuracy. Missing the target meant wasted lives elsewhere. Crews who would have to fly again tomorrow to hit what this one failed to destroy. The pilot hesitated only briefly. "Bombs away," he said. When the release toggles were thrown, several thousand pounds fell away from the aircraft. The B-17 lurched upward slightly, suddenly lighter, more responsive. It was a small mercy. Leaving the target area was worse than entering it. Without the formation's protection, the fortress was alone. Fighters returned in waves, head on pass, slashing attacks from above. The tail gunner fired until his barrels glowed faintly in the thin air. Waist gunners shouted bearings, voices tight with strain. Every maneuver cost altitude. The pilot flew gently, resisting the urge to dive or turn sharply. Aggressive movements could push the aircraft past its narrow margin of control. At 20,000 feet, then 18,000, then 15,000, the bomber descended. Below them lay enemy-held territory for hundreds of miles. Bailing out was an option, but not a good one. Parachutes open low were vulnerable. Capture was likely, survival uncertain, so they stayed with the airplane. Here is where the design of the B-17 mattered. The aircraft's wing was thick, with a high aspect ratio that generated lift efficiently even at lower speeds. Control surfaces were large and responsive. Redundancy was built into almost every system. Dual control cables, multiple hydraulic backups, manual overrides. Pilots could trim the aircraft to reduce control forces, essentially balancing the wounded bomber in the air. But this was not something done casually. It required constant attention. Airspeed had to be maintained just above stall. Too slow and the wing would quit. Too fast and drag would overwhelm the remaining engines. It was a razor's edge. According to post-war engineering analyses, many B-17s in this condition flew at speeds barely 10 to 15 miles per hour above stall. There was no room for error. Inside, the crew worked with grim focus. The navigator recalculated constantly, seeking the shortest route back to friendly lines. The radio operator listened for calls, for signals, for anything that might guide them. The flight engineer monitored temperatures on the remaining engines, terrified that one more failure would doom them all. No one spoke of it aloud. The ball turret gunner remained curled beneath the aircraft, feeling every vibration through the metal shell around him. He knew that if the landing gear failed, he might not be able to rotate the turret and escape. These were thoughts you did not dwell on. You worked. Somewhere west of the Rhine, the flak thinned. Fighters grew less frequent. The aircraft was lower now, skimming clouds, the ground uncomfortably close. When the coast finally appeared, it felt unreal. The North Sea was a slate-gray expanse below them, choppy and cold. Ditching out there would be fatal. Everyone knew it. The pilot nursed the aircraft onward, inch by inch, mile by mile. Fuel gauges were low, oil pressure wavered, but the engines held. England appeared through breaks in the cloud. The airfield lay ahead, a long strip of grass, ringed by vehicles and tiny figures already aware that something was wrong. Landing a B-17 was never simple. Landing one on two engines, battle, damaged, with compromised hydraulics, was something else entirely. The pilot lowered the gear. One wheel locked. The other hesitated, then dropped. The flaps came down unevenly, increasing drag. Airspeed bled away. Too fast, and the aircraft might ground, loop, or break apart. Too slow, and it would stall short of the field. The pilot denned a lower docks plast. The pilot held the yoke with both hands, every muscle tight. The fortress touched down hard. Metal screamed. One tire burst. The aircraft slewed sideways, throwing dirt and debris into the air. Then, mercifully, it stopped. Silence followed. Then cheers. Ground crews ran toward the bomber, staring in disbelief at the damage. Anterior sections of wing skin were gone. Engines were burned, out husks, control surfaces were shredded, and yet the aircraft had flown. Photographs taken afterward would circulate through briefings and newspapers, held up as proof of the Flying Fortress's toughness. But for the men who stepped out onto English soil, it was simpler than that. They were alive. Stories like this became legend, but they also informed change. Engineers studied damage patterns. Pilots refined emergency procedures. Training emphasized feathering techniques, weight reduction, and trim management. And for the Germans, these stories were unsettling. Fighter pilots reported bombers that refused to fall, aircraft that soaked up punishment far beyond expectation. The B-17 earned its reputation not because it was invincible, but because when everything went wrong, it sometimes gave its crew just enough chance. In the next part, we will step back from a single mission and examine the broader question. How often did this really happen? What physics allowed it? And where the legend ends and reality begins? Because behind every story of survival is a hard truth. Many others never made it home. By the end of 1943, the legend of the Flying Fortress had spread far beyond the airfields of England. It was a subject of discussion in mess halls among aircraft crews. In airfield hangars, engineers argued about it. German intelligence officers analyzed it with increasing exasperation. Pictures of bombed B-17s that had managed to get back to their airfields were passed around like badges of honor as a testament to how well these aircraft withstand damage well beyond anyone's expectations. But legends have this remarkable ability to simplify reality. So now we take a step back, one plane, one crew, one miracle of survival, and consider the tougher question: how often did B-17s truly spend time in the air with two engines out? And why did some people survive while so many others did not? The solutions reside at the crossroads of physics, design philosophy, and war. Learning curves are brutal. The reputation of the B-17 was built on survivors, but the war was written just as much by the dead. According to U.S. Army Air Force's records, over 12,700 B-17s were built during the war. Of those, approximately 4,700 were lost in combat, a staggering number. Thousands more were damaged beyond repair. Daylight bombing over Europe was, statistically, one of the most dangerous assignments in the Allied war effort. In 1943, before long-range fighter escorts became common, casualty rates on some missions exceeded 10%. That meant a crewman flying 25 missions, the required tour, faced odds that bordered on impossible. So when a B-17 returned with two engines gone, it was not the norm, it was the exception. Before combat ever tested the Flying Fortress, engineers had already defined its limits. Boeing performance manuals were clear. A fully loaded B-17 at operational altitude was not guaranteed to maintain level flight on two engines, especially not with damage, icing, or uneven thrust. These aircraft were designed with safety margins, but not mirror. What combat revealed was that real-world conditions sometimes aligned in ways manuals could not predict. Bombs dropped early, fuel burned off. Damage that looked catastrophic turned out to spare critical structural members. Pilots flew with instinct honed by terror. And sometimes the physics worked just well enough. The key factor was which. If both engines on one wing were knocked out, survival odds dropped sharply. The asymmetric thrust created extreme yaw, forcing pilots to fight constant turning forces. Even feathered propellers could not fully eliminate drag. Many aircraft in this condition rolled uncontrollably or lost altitude too quickly to recover. But when one engine was lost on each wing, as in the story from Part 2, the aircraft could, under certain conditions, maintain balance. Power was reduced, yes, but thrust symmetry mattered more than raw horsepower. This configuration gave skilled pilots something to work with. At the heart of the B-17 survival lay its wing. The Fortress had a large wing area relative to its weight, allowing it to generate lift at comparatively low speeds. This meant pilots could fly just above stall, maximizing lift while minimizing drag. But flying this close to the edge required constant attention, too much pitch, and the airflow would separate from the wing, stalling it instantly. Too little, and altitude would bleed away beyond recovery. Pilots described it as balancing on a knife blade, and all of this occurred while under attack. One of the most critical procedures in these scenarios was propeller feathering. A stopped propeller left unfeathered would spin freely in the slipstream, acting like a massive air brake. Drag increased dramatically. In some cases, it made controlled flight impossible. Feathering turned the blade's edge onto the airflow, reducing resistance. But feathering required time and functioning systems. Flak often damaged hydraulic lines or control cables. Fires forced rapid shutdowns. Some crews failed to feather in time, sealing their fate. Those who succeeded bought themselves precious minutes. Minutes that could mean the difference between crashing in enemy territory and reaching the coast. Aircraft do not save themselves. Crews did. Pilot skill varied widely in the early years of the war. Many men arrived in Europe with limited flight hours, trained quickly to meet the desperate demand for air crews. By late 1943 and 1944, experience began to matter. Veteran pilots learned how to feel the airplane, how to sense buffet, drag, and trim pressure through the controls. They learned when to sacrifice altitude for airspeed, when to jettison equipment, when to trust the machine, and when to abandon it. Accounts from post-war interviews repeatedly emphasized this point, that the same damage that killed one crew might be survivable for another. A B-17 on a bombing mission was heavy. Bomb load, fuel, ammunition, armor, crew, anything that could be thrown out was thrown out. Gunners dumped ammunition belts. Radios were abandoned. Even machine guns were jettisoned in some cases. Crews sometimes shoved debris out of waste windows, watching it tumble into the void below. Every pound mattered. There are recorded cases where crews even removed their own parachutes after deciding they would not bail out, reducing weight by ounces that psychologically, at least, felt meaningful. Survival narrowed down to margins so small they bordered on absurd. For every successful return, there were dozens that ended differently. Some aircraft lost 2 engines and entered uncontrollable descents. Others caught fire and broke apart mid-air. Still others were forced down in occupied territory, crews captured or killed. German records describe bombers seen hanging in the air, descending slowly, fighting gravity, and then suddenly rolling over, vanishing into cloud or flame. The difference between survival and destruction was often invisible from the outside. A severed control cable, a jammed trim tab, a pilot who hesitated half a second too long. The legend of the Flying Fortress was built on the survivors, but it was haunted by the silent majority that never came back. German fighter pilots respected the B-17, but they were not awed by it. To them, the fortress was dangerous but killable. Luftwaffe combat reports describe aircraft that refused to fall, absorbing repeated hits. But they also detail specific tactics designed to overwhelm bomber durability. Head-on attacks, cannon fire aimed at wing routes, coordinated strikes as bomber losses mounted. German pilots learned where to aim. The fortress's reputation did not make it invulnerable. It made it a challenge. Back in England, the story simplified. Crews told stories of aircraft that shouldn't have made it. Photographs were pinned to bulletin boards. New arrivals listened wide-eyed, clinging to the belief that the airplane would protect them. This belief mattered. Morale in a bombing campaign was fragile. Faith in the machine, however irrational, kept crews climbing back into aluminum tubes mission after mission. The B-17 became more than metal. It became hope. The truth, as always, is more complicated. The B-17 did not defy physics. It lived at the very edge of them. It stayed airborne with 2 engines gone, not because it was invincible, but because its designers built in margins. Its crews learned to exploit them, and sometimes the sky allowed it. Sometimes. In the final part of this documentary, we will look at what these survivals changed, how they influenced bomber design, doctrine, and the legacy of the men who flew them. Because the story of a B-17 staying in the air is not just about engineering. It is about what humans demand of machines, and what machines demand in return. Long after the engines fell still, the story of the B-17 lived on. When the war ended in 1945, Europe was in ruins. Airfields that hummed with the roar of departing bombers were silent. Aircrews headed home. Uniforms were packed away. The Flying Fortress, the spearhead of the daylight bombers, was quickly scrapped from the active list, but the truths inscribed upon it through the scars are not extinguished. They transformed aviation, strategy, and history in ways that reverberate to this day. In the years following victory, the USS Army Air Force turned internally. The combat data was analyzed to a level of detail that had never before occurred. There were damage reports, gun cam footage, pilot debriefs, and engineering evaluations. None of it was to be celebrated. It was to be studied. Why could aircraft survive catastrophic damage? Why did others fail? One conclusion emerged quickly. Redundancy saved lives. The B-17's multiple control runs, distributed fuel tanks, and conservative structural design allowed partial failures without immediate loss of the aircraft. Engineers realized that survivability was not just armor, it was options. If one system failed, another could take over. This philosophy would shape post-war aircraft design, both military and civilian. The lessons learned from crippled fortresses influenced the next generation of bombers. Aircraft like the B-29 Superfortress incorporated even greater redundancy, improved fire suppression, and more powerful engines capable of sustaining flight after damage. Later strategic bombers, from the B-52 onward, were designed with the expectation that they might be hit and must continue. Even commercial aviation absorbed these lessons. Modern airliners are certified to fly and land safely after losing an engine at takeoff. Some can fly long distances on a single engine. The concept of engine outperformance, now taken for granted, was forged in combat. It began with bombers limping home over Europe. For the crews, survival did not end when the aircraft stopped rolling. Many veterans carried vivid memories of those moments at the edge of control, when the sky seemed to decide their fate. Some spoke openly about it, others never did. Interviews conducted decades later reveal a common theme: gratitude mixed with guilt. Men who survived missions with two engines gone often wondered why they lived when others did not. They remembered friends whose aircraft vanished into cloud and flak. Survival felt undeserved, and yet many also remembered the airplane itself, not just as a tool, but as a presence. Veterans spoke of trusting the fortress, of feeling it respond even when logic said it should not. That emotional bond between human and machine was forged under extreme stress. It lasted a lifetime. Some of those battered B-17 survived the war itself. A handful were repaired, repurposed, or sold. Others were scrapped. Their metal melted down into peacetime products. But a few escaped destruction and found new lives as cargo planes, research aircraft, or museum pieces. Today, only a small number of B-17s remain airworthy. When they fly, the sound is unmistakable, four radial engines beating the air in a rhythm that once meant war. For those who know the history, that sound carries weight. It is the echo of aircraft that flew on two engines when they should not have flown at all. Museums around the world display B-17s with careful reverence. Visitors walk beneath their wings, peer into cramped turrets, and trace fingers along patched skin. Placards list missions flown, damage sustained, crews lost. Some displays show photographs of fortresses that returned with entire sections missing, evidence of survival that borders on the unbelievable. But these are not myths. They are records, and each record represents a moment when physics, engineering, and human will align just long enough. So what does it mean that a B-17 could stay in the air with two engines gone? It does not mean the aircraft was invincible. It means it was forgiving. Forgiving of damage, forgiving of fear, forgiving of the desperate, imperfect decisions made by young men under fire. The Flying Fortress did not save everyone, but it saved enough to matter, enough to shape belief, enough to change design, enough to become legend. Picture it one last time. A battered bomber, limping across gray water toward England, toward two engines silent. One wing scorched, control cables hanging by threads, 10 men inside, exhausted, frozen, alive. The aircraft does not soar, it merely refuses to fall. That refusal, quiet, mechanical, stubborn, is what made the B-17 more than an airplane. It made it a symbol of endurance. And that is why, decades later, we still ask how it stayed in the air, because in that question is another one, deeper and harder to answer. How far can human design and determination push the limits of what should be possible?